And we thank you for the forgiveness of sins that we have through him. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, let's crack open our Bibles to Daniel. Again, we're not really studying through this book per se, chapter by chapter and things. We're more looking at Daniel, the person, through what is said in this book. So let's open up to Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be spending our time today. Again, that is Daniel chapter 6. Now, again, since, excuse me, sorry. Again, since we're kind of jumping around Daniel, we need to keep in mind some context as we get into some of these sections that we're dealing with. Now, before we were kind of looking at the King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel's relationship with him. But as we move in here to chapter 6, we've kind of moved forward in history. Because when we were talking about Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel's relationship with him, God's people were under Babylonian rule. But now here in chapter 6, as I said, we move forward in history, and God's people are now under the rulership of the Medes and the Persians. We ask why? Well, one reason is because the Medes and the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, and that occurred somewhere between 539 and 537 BC. We're not going to spend a lot of time with history, but that just gives us some historical context. And since that's true, at this point in the book of Daniel, Daniel is now a little bit older. He's no longer a teenager as he was in the opening chapters of this book. Now, furthermore, it is in what we also know about chapter 6 is that Daniel chapter 6 is one of the more familiar chapters of Daniel because it is in this chapter where we find the story of Daniel being cast into the lion's den. But what is not familiar of this chapter is what led up to Daniel being cast into the lion's den. And in short, what led up to Daniel being cast into the lion's den was really his devotion to God. It was a form of persecution, I would say. But it's this point about Daniel's devotion to God that we're going to examine today from the text of verses 10 through 15 of this chapter, where we find 2 points about how we see Daniel's devotion to God. The first point we find in verses 10 and 11 is that Daniel's devotion to God is seen through his prayers to God. And the second point we find in verses 12 through 15 is that Daniel's devotion to God is seen through his obedience to God. Now, after looking at these things, what we will learn is that we must also be a people who are devoted to God. We'll talk about that when we get there. But with those things in mind, again, we're in Daniel 6. We'll read through verses 10 through 15, and then we'll look at the points. Daniel 6, beginning in verse 10, we read, Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Okay. So we're looking at this idea of Daniel's devotion to God, and we're going to talk about it through what is written in this text. But first of all, it's seen through his prayers to God. Now, this point is introduced with the author of Daniel recording in verse 10. Daniel becomes aware of a document that had been signed. And what is he doing here in verse 10? Thank you, Elaine, for closing those doors. But what's he doing here in verse 10, Daniel? He continues praying. And how many times a day? 3 times a day. And so he's been praying, he's giving thanks to God, and this is something he's already been doing. The text says he'd been doing this previously. Now, with that in mind, again, we have to get some context. We have to first talk about this document that had been, we'll get there in a moment. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Daniel finds out about the signing of this document, and this document is something we read about in verses 8 and 9. So I'll just read those verses. We'll jump back to verses 8 and says, "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Daniel becomes aware of this document, and as was already said, he's praying. Where is he praying? His home. Now you have the words upper room there? Okay. Now the New American Standard has roof chamber, but this is an upper room of sorts, and we'll see why in just a moment. But yes, he's at his home. He's in his upper room. New American Standard has roof chamber. So with that in mind, this upper room or roof chamber, whatever you have there, it was a room on the roof of the house, and it functioned as sort of a private area of the home. The rest of the home was public. You'd have people, but then you go up into this upper room. It was a more private area. Now, what else are we told about this roof chamber, upper room? Elaine, go ahead. Okay, so you have upper chamber and windows toward Jerusalem. Okay. And do you have the windows toward Jerusalem idea there? Okay, Mandy's saying yes. Okay, good. I'm glad we all have that, because that's important information. So this is included for a reason. This private area had windows open toward Jerusalem, and there was a reason for that that's important. Earlier in time, Jews were commanded to pray toward Jerusalem. We read about that in 1 Kings 8, 35 through 48. It was Solomon that gave this command. But also, we see that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. That just is emphasizing the fact that Daniel prayed regularly. Now also, something else we should realize from this verse is that based on the context, is that by continuing to pray in the way that he is, Daniel's breaking the law. This law said, nope, don't pray to anyone but the king. Who's Daniel praying to? God. Now, I bring that out because this is something important to remember. Now, as New Testament Christians, what are we commanded to do in our relationship with the government? Obey the law. That's Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. There's an unless, and we'll talk about the unless a little bit later. But that's what Daniel is doing. He is breaking the law, but he's obeying God. And again, we'll get to that a little bit later in the text. We'll talk about that more. But we need to keep that in mind. That's why this information, verse 10, is all included. He's breaking the law. But he's not only breaking the law, he's breaking it 3 times a day in his prayers to God. So he's obeying the laws of God rather than the laws of the land in this particular case. Any other questions or comments on verse 10? Go ahead, Elaine. Yeah. Right. That is an observation we can make. Jeremiah, go ahead. Is it 5 times? I thought it was 3 times. 5 times. Okay. I had it in my mind it was 3 too. Yeah. I had it in my mind it was 3 too, but I guess it's 5. Okay. I'm just saying that's okay that that comes to our mind because it is a similar concept going on here because back in 1 Kings, the passage I mentioned, Solomon told them, you have to pray toward Jerusalem. Daniel's doing this 3 times a day. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. Verse 11, what happens? Okay, so some men come along. They find out that he's praying. Now again, where is Daniel praying? He's in his home in a very private area. They came by agreement. Okay. Right, there is this is an agreement that's mentioned. So first of all, we have to see, well, who are the men that came? That's where we have to jump back to verse 7. The men who came were that verse 7 says, the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. So it's those men who told the king what should happen that come by agreement. So they colluded, we might say. But just based on what's happening here, what's the agreement they made? Okay, that's true. But they're singling Daniel out. So what's another possibility that the agreement they made? Okay, they were the enforcers. But Daniel's praying in a very private area. They find out. How would they have found out? They've been watching him. Jeremiah, go ahead.
They didn't even have to watch him. In Habakkuk, it was required for all Jews to pray 3 times a day.
Okay.
It happened with the prophets before Daniel, which means they knew every Jew is going to pray if they aren't about to 3 times a day. They just had to wait till and pick an opportune time.
That probably. But the agreement here is probably made is they know Daniel. They know his relationship with the government and that he's a good man, but they were probably spying on him. So they were, as Jeremiah pointed out, they were looking for that opportune time to find Daniel in the act of breaking this law that was in place.
You might have talked about this last Sunday, but obviously they were wanting to get rid of him.
What's that, Don?
They were wanting to get rid of him.
They are wanting to get rid of him.
I'm sure you talked about this, but
Right. But this is just government officials from verse 7. This isn't necessarily all the conjurers and other people we've talked about.
these were government officials.
They were high up. Right. Maybe. But the point here in verse 11 is simply that these men came by agreement and they caught Daniel praying and violating this act that had been put into place. Anything else on verse 11? Okay. What we're looking at is in the context of Daniel and his character. And Daniel's devotion to God here is seen through his prayers to God. Daniel was a man of prayer. Now, what has also been shown in these verses is that Daniel prayed regularly, even when it violated the laws of the land. And so what we see in these verses is an example of how Daniel obeyed God rather than man, even if it meant breaking the laws of the land. And we see examples of that in the New Testament. Peter over in Acts. I don't have the passage in front of me. But he's dealing with the other religious leaders who are persecuting him for preaching the gospel. And one thing he says, we must obey God rather than man. That's Daniel's mindset here. But we're not done. We see another way Daniel's devotion to God is seen in verses 12 through 15. And this is where we're going to get more into the obedience aspect. So this point is introduced in verse 12. I'll just read it again. It says, and they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? Now Daniel's not mentioned in this verse, but it's more these men who had caught him. What are they doing here in verse 12? What are they saying to the king? What's that, Dean? Okay, they're introducing what they might be going to do, but what are they reminding the king about here in verse 12? He signed it. Right, so they're reminding him of what the king did. You signed this injunction, this document, about what's going to happen. What was the consequence for breaking the law? According to thrown into the lion's den. And that's what's going to happen to Daniel later in the chapter. So with all that in mind, one thing we should understand from this verse is that in saying what they say here, these officials are now beginning their accusation against Daniel for having broken this injunction that the king had signed into the law. Where the word injunction here is just another word of referring to the document had been signed forbidding people to pray to anyone but the king. Now, how long was this injunction going to last? 30 days. So this was just a 30-day period. But what else are we told about this law? They'd be cast into the den of lions, but could that be changed? No. It's binding. It's irrevocable. If the king signs something, you cannot change it according to law. Anything else on verse 12? Right, the Medes and the Persians law. That's the law we're talking about in this particular case. Anything else on verse 12? Okay. So verse 13, we now see the accusation. What's the accusation according to the text? Exactly. They are framing Daniel here. They're accusing him. They do identify. Now, the New American Standard has one of the exiles from Judah. But why include that detail? Blake already kind of said it. They're singling him out as a Jew. Or as Blake put it, his foreign status. He's not one of us, king. So he's paying no attention to you and to what you say. But they also add this detail. He's making his petition 3 times a day. So king, he's not paying attention to you, but he's breaking your law and doing it 3 times a day. They're emphasizing this fact of him continually breaking the law multiple times a day. Anything else on verse 13? Right. Right. They're trying to just make him angry. Right. Exactly. Now, what's that, Mary? Right. Right, the way he conducted himself, even being in exile, he had a very good relationship with the government. Under Babylonian rule, he'd reached a pretty high position before the Medes and Persians came and conquered the Babylonians. And so these men, these other government officials are making this accusation, but then we reach verse 14. How does the king respond? He was is that the word you have there, displeased, Alex? Sword with displeased? Okay. Sword, S-O-R-E. Wow. Sword with displeased. I hadn't seen sword in there. New American Standard has deeply distressed. So he's sad, but he's grieved at the situation, and what does he decide to do? To deliver Daniel. So and save him. Save him from what? From the lion's den. That is certain death. So, what is he not concerned with, according to this verse? Okay, that's true. But nothing comes up about him having broken the law here. He's more concerned about what's going to happen to Daniel because he broke the law. But he doesn't say anything about the breaking of the law itself. Now, how long is he trying to carry out this effort of rescuing him? All day until sundown, and the text adds even until sunset. He kept exerting himself to rescue him. So he's making every effort to try to keep Daniel from suffering this consequence that would come as a result of breaking the law. Anything else on verse 14? Yeah. Probably that wearing sackcloth and ashes kind of situation. But anything else on verse 14? Okay. So having recorded these things in verse 15, we reach, the text goes on to say, then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So we're back to one of the principles we've already discussed. They come by agreement. We see that word again. So again, we ask, what agreement did they make in this case? Right. So the first agreement was, let's go spy on Daniel, find him out. Now, we're not told this in the text, I'll admit that, but we still have to ask that question. What's the agreement they made? So here in verse 15, we ask again, what agreement did they make? Let's go remind the king of what the law is. That the law is, when something's signed into law, you can't change it. Daniel has broken the law. And so he goes to the lion's den. That's part of this. I mean, that's probably it. And he's a foreigner in a position of power. Now let's illustrate this a little bit. Move over to the Gospels. In its simplest sense, the reason Jesus got crucified the way that he did is because the religious leaders were jealous of the influence he was gaining. Now that's just putting it in the cultural context. We know there was more to the crucifixion than that, but Mark, we just studied Mark in the Wednesday night class. Starting in chapter 14, you begin to see that these religious leaders are now setting out to kill him. And a lot of the reason for that was because of fear and jealousy and the popularity, for lack of a better term, that Jesus was getting. Same thing here. These other government officials are pushing for Daniel's execution because they are jealous that this exile from Judah is gaining influence and has this relationship with the king that he does, that these other officials don't. And so they get the king to sign this law. Here in verse 15, King, here's what the law says, and you can't change it. Anything else on verse 15? Probably. Always is. Right. That does, yeah, that still happens. Anything else on verse 15?
Well, they were pretty, I don't know where brave is a word, but they were, because obviously they had this well planned.
Right.
And they were doing something the king didn't, or they were trying to go against the king in doing this because they knew he liked him.
Mm-hmm.
So, highly risky, and of course it pays off later in a bad way for them. But still, you wonder, boy, you just wonder, boy, you guys really had some gall there to be doing this, given
Right.
how much power the king has, absolute power.
David or Daniel? I Yeah, there was back in the under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, he did stop it from happening, but that was under Babylonian rule. Here in chapter 6, we've moved forward in history to the Medes and Persians being in positions of power. So, and this is a different situation altogether. Now, back in chapter 5, Daniel did interpret a dream. But we've jumped forward here to chapter 6, and this doesn't deal anything with a dream. This just deals with the other government officials. Yeah. He's I'm not going to say several hundred years because that wouldn't be true. 60 years? Under what verse? 6:13. Daniel had lived over 60 years in Babylon. His loyalty to the rulers was well known. In spite of that loyalty, his consistent faithfulness to God brought this threat. Okay, that's the footnote you're referring to. Yeah. So he's probably an old man by now. Yeah. At least. I'm sorry, I said again. Nebuchadnezzar and then Nebuchadnezzar's son, and this is Darius. So yes, this would be at least king number 3, so that he's under. So, and Nebuchadnezzar's son is the one that was slain in chapter 5. So Belshazzar, I think, was his name. Good questions, good points. Anything else on verse 15? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 12 through 15 about Daniel's devotion to God is that Daniel's devotion to God is seen in his obedience to God. Now, Daniel's not mentioned in these verses. Well, he is. But one thing that underlies what we read about in these verses is the fact of Daniel's obedience to God. He was obeying God and praying the way that he did. This is what brought all these things on. But he obeyed God, even if it meant disobeying man. Now, as a result, what we again see here is that Daniel obeyed the laws of God, even when it meant disobedience to the laws of man. And this is something that would put his life at risk, but not without the king seeking to protect it. So, when we consider everything that the author of Daniel has recorded in verses 10 through 15, the point we should be left with as far as Daniel's character goes is that Daniel was a man who was devoted to God. His devotion to God is seen through his prayers to God. His devotion to God is seen in his obedience to God. So what we should learn from these verses is that we must be a people who are devoted to God. Now, in the world we live in today, being devoted to God is something that is becoming more and more difficult. Now, based on these verses, one reason devotion to God is becoming more difficult is because sometimes laws are put in place that can conflict with the laws of God. But even though this is the case, we as God's people must continue to devote ourselves to him. We can do that through the avenue of prayer. Another way we can devote ourselves to him is by continuing to obey him, even if it means disobeying man. Because we are put in those positions where sometimes we have to obey God over man. Let me just give you a simple example. Your employer wants you to work on Sunday. Sorry, I can't be there. I have church obligations. Now that might be one scenario. But the most important way we devote ourselves to God is by devoting ourselves to serving our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Now again, those are just some applications we can learn from the things we have studied today. Any other questions or comments? All right. Matt, will you close us with prayer?